to water it. So I decided I would start doing lawn removals and sprinkler evaluations with Resource Central. Oh, Tori, I think you might be muted.
So sorry, thanks, Hayden. So big picture, why we're talking about turf removal, you can hit that next slide, Hayden. So as most people probably know, we have drastically changed the landscape in Colorado. You know, back in the 1800s, there really weren't a lot of trees, and it was just kind of that native landscape. When you look at Boulder now, we have a very large urban tree canopy, and we've implemented a lot of turf. And so as we look at turf removal, oh, you could go back, Hayden. So as we look at turf removal, a lot of it is really just to kind of go back to that native landscape. Obviously, we're never going to go fully back to that picture that you see on the left, but it's all about how do we have an urban life that is more in sync with the native landscape. Now you can go ahead, Hayden. As you've probably seen in the news, we definitely are in a mega drought, especially in our region. And as you've probably seen in Arizona, some of the heat waves that they're dealing with. And so as we're kind of having to readjust to the mega drought, everyone is looking for ways to conserve water. So I know we've had a lot of rain this year, but you can't dig yourself out of a mega drought in 1 year of precipitation. It would take anywhere between 6 to 10 years of this level of precipitation to get us out of the hole we're in. And so looking at landscape change is really looking at long-term. How do we conserve water? Even if we do have, let's say we did have 6 years of precipitation like we've had, it's really about changing into using what we have in a responsible way. So you can go ahead and hit next, Hayden.
Awesome. So in this presentation, we're going to kind of cover everything there is to removing lawns. So we're going to talk about how to plan and design a space that works best for your home, and understand what it actually involves, and what it requires for you to remove your non-functional turf. We're going to talk about how you prep and prepare this space. There's kind of a lengthy process for some people regarding HOAs, 811, stuff like that. Then we'll talk about the fun stuff, actually removing turf, and go over various methods on turf removal that works well for a lot of people, and just kind of share that knowledge. And then lastly, we'll just cover how to plant and convert the space, and kind of how to convert into a low water irrigation system. So the first thing you should do before even planning or prepping your space is some research. A great thing to do is check with your neighbors and learn what they do. I'm sure everyone has seen neighbors or houses in your guys' neighborhoods are changing drastically. A lot of front yards are turning into xeriscapes, which is great. So that's always a great resource. Another great resource is to ask a professional. Reach out to your local landscaper, landscape architect, or any local professional in your area. Another great resource is doing online research. Find out what everyone's doing online. We have a great website called waterwiseyards.org. You can also go to the ALCC, which is the Associated Landscape Contractors of Colorado, to try and meet with a professional to help with that.
Yeah, and so Waterwise Yards, as mentioned from Hayden, if you go to this website, you can check out the Inspiration Hub, and that's where you'll be able to see things that people have done. Hayden, I believe you can hit next. We can give a quick glance. So you can filter by different criterias, and so you can see project size, time commitment, you can see how much people spent, and that'll just kind of give you some ideas of what the possibilities are, and then you'll be able to click on one and kind of get more information on each one with additional photos. So it's a great resource just to get inspired. You can always, you know, check out Pinterest or Google, but this is going to be people who actually live in Colorado and have done it with our, you know, specific landscape. So it's just going to give you a lot of resources.
One thing I do want to mention about Waterwise Yards is a lot of people post on here and they actually aren't associated with Resource Central. So like this homeowner put on this. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. This homeowner put on waterwiseyards.org, and they didn't participate in any of our programs. They were just sharing what they did and kind of how difficult it was. So it's really a great resource. So before you're starting, you want to check with your local municipal codes. Make sure there isn't any red tape you need to cut through before starting your project. Depending on your zip code and where you live, there may be you may be limited to what you can do and what you can actually replace your turf with. The big one that comes to mind is HOAs. We did cover another Waterwise webinar that is actually online, and it covers getting HOA response and how to navigate those muddy waters. But once you check with your local municipal codes and HOAs, you need to find a location. I know that sounds silly, but a lot of people want to remove turf, but have no idea where to start or what to do. Therefore, you need to find an area that you deem to be non-functional turf. For those of you who may not know what non-functional turf is, it is essentially any space covered by turf that is simply aesthetic value. So backyards with dogs, pets, kids are typically being used. Ideally, we would want all the turf gone, but I totally get that it's nice to have a barbecue on the weekends and use that backyard space. So if you decide that your side yard's not being used, your front yard's not being used, those are great places to start to find non-functional turf. So then you decide, I'm going to take up that side yard and convert it to a xeriscape area with a low water use. So you're going to want to make a plan. Hopefully you have some ideas on what you want to do, talking to your neighbors, local professionals, anything like that. But if you're going to start a turf removal project, you're going to want to go all the way. Again, like in this picture, really nice flowers and xeriscapes look really nice. And so you want to be the neighbor that catches everyone's eyes. You don't want to start your turf removal project and just have a dirt patch for multiple years sitting there. No one likes those neighbors. So make sure you run through a proper plan, look at all the costs and everything that would go into it. Things like removal, plants, ground cover, ground materials like mulch or gravel, and then how you're actually going to limit your watering. So figuring out irrigation conversion parts and everything you would need. I think I might have froze there, but do you need HOA approval? Colorado House Bill was recently passed and increased protection for property owners who wish to xeriscape. And so there's some protection there. Again, checking with your HOA, I would definitely watch our webinar on how to navigate your HOA during a xeriscape. So prepping the area, you're going to want to first flag all your sprinkler heads. Make sure you put flags over water well covers and sprinkler heads and everything like that. So we will go into various removal methods here in a minute, but I do want to make sure that if you're planning to use a sod cutter or dig or something like that, you're going to want to contact 811 before you do so. It's better to be safe than sorry. Along with this, you're going to want to take accurate measurements after you're flagging heads and make sure you know how big your area is that you're removing. In our program specific, we'll run into a lot of people who don't know actually how big their space is. And that can be an issue, especially with cost. And you'll need to factor in things like disposal. So it does cost money to remove turf. There are methods of removing it without disposing of it, which we'll dive into in a little bit. But you're just going to want to make sure that the area is accurate. That way you can account for how much material you will actually need, plants, mulch, everything like that. Like I've mentioned a little bit in this presentation, removal is a really big thing to do for some people. So you really need to figure out how much your project's going to take. A lot of people are attending this seminar because if you do it yourself, it's going to be cheaper than hiring a professional, and that's great. So you're really going to want to make sure that local areas are able to dispose of your sod, figure out, composting costs, how long composting is going to take, stuff like that. So really just, running through all the numbers and making sure everything's right. The final thing you want to do is lay out the space. It's a good idea to mark out where everything is going to go, especially your different plant elements. Especially, if you remove a 200 square foot space and you have 500 square feet of plants, they're not going to all fit. So you're going to want to make sure you're allocating a proper amount of plants and material for that space. So it's a great idea to lay out before you actually start. So now we're going to actually dive into the good part of the presentation, and that's the turf removal methods. We're going to talk about the main three. We'll, obviously there'll be a good choice for anybody in this presentation, but there is more than just these three options, and we'll cover a couple others towards the end. But you have to remember that there are pros and cons to every method, whether you pick a quick project, a long project, there's cheap options. It's really up to you, and however you would go and choose whatever option you would choose. Make sure it's the best one for you. Some of them are very labor intensive and some of them are not. So it's really up to you. But the first one we're going to cover today is solarization. Solarization is a fairly simple process. There's not much to it. So what is solarization? What is it? It's the process of overheating and basically burning out your turf using a plastic tarp. Essentially this works, however, there are some clear drawbacks. So first I'm going to talk about the process and then we'll get into the pros and cons. But you're going to want to turn your water off in that zone or stop watering the area you intend to remove, mow or cut the grass as short as possible. This way, this allows for the grass to not lay over on each other and cover other root areas. So get that mower setting as low as you can go. And the shorter you cut the grass, the less leafy material there is to help with photosynthesizing and supplying optimal sunlight to those roots. You'll want to make sure that you rake and clean the area. Make sure that every inch of the turf has the highest heat influx. And this includes pulling weeds in the area. If you have very large weeds, they're going to cover a good portion of the grass. So you want to make sure you want to pull all those. But then you're going to cover the area in a thick, solid, clear or black plastic tarp. As you can see in this photo, it's a clear tarp, but black plastic works as well because it absorbs heat. So what you're going to want to do is get a very large continuous piece so it can trap and absorb as much heat as possible. This will eliminate airflow. If you use multiple pieces, it may allow for heat to escape, which will make it so it's not properly sealed. Along with this, you're going to want to make sure you patch and seal any holes in the plastic. And then around the perimeter, you're going to want to bury that tarp. That way, there is no airflow or anything coming in. So like I mentioned, you're going to want to cover the edges. You're going to want to seal that tarp. And the best way to do this is to use dirt or small size gravel. Sand works great as well, but you're going to want to cover all the edges to keep that heat in. So the pros to this is it's cheap. Everybody has tarps laying around, and usually you wouldn't have to go get one. You can do it in sections if you'd like, do 100 square feet at once and kind of move the tarp around. It's fairly easy to do. You don't have to regularly maintain your yard. In that area, you won't have to mow or water anymore. So once you set the tarp, you kind of just leave it, which is really great. And then there's little to no manual labor after this part, aside from, picking that tarp up and moving it around if you choose, or putting it away, because once it settles in, all that grass will just be dead and it'll be a bare dirt patch. So the cons to solarization is that even though this is an affordable and great option, there are, a few drawbacks. For this type of removal to work, you need to apply this method during the hottest parts of the year. So you're looking at June, July, August, areas where it's times of the year where it's going to be really hot. As Tori mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of rain this year. So people who maybe have started solarization this year may have not had the best of luck, just because it has been cooler and there's been a lot of rain keeping that ground saturated. Another thing is this method can take up to 3 months to complete. You need to make sure all that grass is dead, and you're not going to be able to just throw a tarp down and then let it cook for 2 or 3 days. It's going to take, multiple months at a time. Sometimes it'll last even longer past the growing season, so even past August. Some people will leave it over winter, just to help, keep that area in and sealed. And then it has to be sealed, because if you're trying to create an oven-like effect in this method, you need to make sure you don't have any holes or any areas where, wind or any sort of airflow can get in under the tarp. This is a really cost-effective way, but you do run the risk of the area's roots and rhizomes making a comeback. Even if the area wasn't burnt to a crisp. This is just because some grasses, the roots get really deep. And so they may go into hibernation. And so this may be a reoccurring method of removal. There's a fairly obvious one here, is that you're introducing a large amount of plastic into your yard. So you not only will want to make sure you dispose of all the plastic when you're done with it, but you want to make sure you dispose of it properly. Another thing with this is that even though it's a big plastic tarp, with the sun and elements beating down on it, you can start to introduce microplastics into your soil, depending on what type of tarp you have and stuff like that. Another issue is that you should do this method in areas where you don't have other vegetation. So if you have large roots for trees and stuff like that, may be problematic, because that heat, it'll burn up everything. It'll get really hot. So those roots may suffer. You're also not going to be getting any water to those roots from above because of this tarp. And if you've done the process correctly, you've actually turned off your zone and turned off your watering. So that's a whole area that's not being watered. And then it can also kill off helpful microorganisms. So if you have a bunch of worms and good critters in your yard, you may fry them to a crisp as well. Hopefully they'll migrate and move away, but you do run into that possible issue. So our second method that we're going to talk about is sheet mulching. So like solarization, this is a fairly simple process. It's a great alternate to solarization if you're willing to put in just a little bit more work. Unlike solarization, this process will create a cool, damp environment to oversaturate your turf and essentially drown it out, creating kind of a composting effect, kind of naturally composting it as you go. So just like solarization, this process is fairly simple, but as I mentioned, it will take a little bit more effort than just putting a tarp down. So just like with solarization, you're going to want to mow or cut that grass to the shortest possible setting. Ideally, you'd want to cut that grass less than 1 inch if possible. Again, the shorter you cut the grass, the less leafy material there is to continue photosynthesizing and supplying optimal sunlight and nutrients to those roots. Again, you're going to want to make sure you rake and clean the area, pulling weeds, make sure there's nothing that can really thrive in a cool, damp environment. Weeds are notorious for growing anywhere. And if you have an area like this with solarization where you are going to be adding water to it, those weeds may run crazy and completely take over. So after you've kind of prepped the space a little bit, you're going to want to cover the area in a layer of cardboard or newspaper. We all love online shopping. Amazon boxes work perfectly for this method. So you're going to want to cover a layer of cardboard or newspapers, and then cover the layer with a layer of dirt, and then another layer of cardboard and newspapers, and kind of create like a lasagna almost in your yard. And then on that final layer, you're going to want to do a thick layer of mulch, like tree bark mulch or shredded mulch or something like that. If you use gravel or rubber mulch, you can run into the risk of light infiltrating onto that surface. If you use shredded mulch or big bark mulch, it tends to stick together when wet, so it can kind of block out all that sunlight. You're going to want to make sure everything is covered. If you've ever worked with mulch before, you know how easy it is to stick together. So make sure that everything is overlapping and really well maintained. Then you're going to want to water. You're going to want to water the area really heavily. Initially, just to create a cool water area to help kill that grass. This allows for the airflow to be limited during the initial covering period. And then once you have the area set and saturated, you want to make sure that it stays damp. You don't want to water it every day, but make sure it stays damp and dark enough to start breaking down and holding that cardboard and newspaper into place. But yeah. So one thing I do want to mention is I covered it a little bit, but you don't water too much, allowing for that weed growth. You want to keep the area from drying out, but you don't want to and keeping that mulch from blowing away or that newspaper and stuff blowing away. But you're going to want to make sure that it's saturated enough to help keep everything together and nice and wet. So some of the pros for sheet mulching is it's cheap. All you need is some form of mulch and a little bit of soil. So not hard to come by in most people's yards. And you can always just get a couple bags of mulch at Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that. But again, it's fairly easy to do as long as you regularly maintain the lasagna or the sheet mulch method. That way you don't get any weeds. So if you do see any weeds coming up, make sure you pull those and stuff like that. But once the cardboard or newspaper starts to break down, after a couple months, it actually acts like a natural compost for your soil. So your soil will almost be amended once all that turf is done. You can kind of till it up and mix it into your soil, and like I said, it'll be a natural compost. And then if it's done correctly and given adequate time, you won't need to do much aside from clean up, the grass and till it in and stuff like that. Maybe pull a few weeds and stuff like that. But some of the cons are just like solarization. Even though this is an affordable option, you still have to wait a long time. This type of removal method needs to be done in the hottest parts of the month as well, just during that growing season. So anytime between July, August, stuff like that, to allow that grass to not enter its dormant stage during the cooler months. Another thing is you may start to get unwanted pests. So unlike solarization, where you may kill off all those microorganisms and microbacteria and stuff like that, you may start to get an influx of bugs and stuff that may be aphids, stuff that may be harmful to other surrounding plants. That's just because it is a cool, damp, kind of swampy environment. Another thing is there's a lot more maintenance to this than solarization, because aside from patching holes in solarization, you need to make sure that everything is covered all the time, it's properly damp, and you're pulling weeds. Another thing with this is the grade. Solarization doesn't work too well if it's on a slope, just because water will run down, and the water as you're actually watering the cardboard or the newspaper in the first couple of weeks, that cardboard or newspaper won't be breaking down yet. So the water will actually run to wherever the cardboard's at. So the areas surrounding mulch or lasagna. Can everybody still hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
I'm not sure what that was, but anyways, the grade, all that water will be running around, and the areas around your sheet mulch may grow significantly. So if you're doing it in the middle of a grassed area, it may increase that grass in the area. Another con is that there's some potential grow back, because you will eventually turn this kind of into a compost area for your soil. You may actually get some of those grass roots and stuff that have made it through and over the years may start to come back. So it's kind of something you need to do periodically every couple of years. As I mentioned, water will kind of run rampant the first couple of weeks. So an issue with sheet mulching is there won't be much water infiltrating your soil, so you can dry up your soil if not done correctly. So that's why we ask that you guys keep it damp and moist, because the quicker that cardboard and newspaper breaks down, the quicker that water can get into your soil to allow for that infiltration and not just dry up your soil as well. This next method is great. It's a little bit more expensive or labor intensive if you're choosing to go this route, but this is actually what we do at Resource Central. We use sod cutters, so it's really straightforward if you're willing to get out on a weekend and just put in a little bit of labor and some work. This is a really quick and efficient way to remove your turf. So just like prepping any area, you're going to want to make sure you mark all your irrigation heads, call 811, make sure they come out before you dig, because you do remove quite a few inches of that soil to make sure you get all those roots. Once you have prepped the area and decided you want to use a sod cutter, you can rent one. There's a lot of places on the Front Range that actually rent sod cutters. Home Depot is a great one, Sunbelt. Any sort of equipment rental place usually has a sod cutter. They're fairly inexpensive for a day, but depending on how big your space is, you may want it longer than a day. You're going to want to make sure you follow the safety instructions and are using the machine the way it's supposed to. But then essentially you're just going to cut large strips of turf in your designated area, and then you're going to roll them up. As you can see in this photo, they create kind of sod rolls like you would see if someone were to be planting fresh sod. And then you're going to want to go around with a flat shovel or an edger or something like that and hand trim and make sure you get all those roots out in the boundary areas or areas around trees or stuff like that. Some sod cutters are very easy to maneuver, but if you do have a large tree or something like that in your area, you're going to want to be really careful around that, because the sod cutter will cut through and damage some of those roots. Usually most trees can scab over and it won't be a huge thing. A lot of people run over tree roots with their lawnmowers and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, it won't be a huge thing, but you do want to be cognizant of that. Then you're going to want to load up and dispose of all your sod. So you're going to want to have a vehicle or something that you can take all this away to. It is fairly heavy, you know, each roll weighs anywhere between 30 to 70 pounds, depending on how wet and how dry the soil is and how deep you cut. So it's a fairly straightforward process. Rent a sod cutter and go to town on your area. But like all the other processes, there are some pros and cons. Some of the pros are it's really quick. Like I said, you could do this in a weekend, even for like 1,000 square feet. It's really straightforward. And once you have it all cut, it's just a matter of hauling it all the way and getting rid of it. It's really efficient. In about an hour, you can cut, 300 square feet fairly quickly. It does create a clean, somewhat level area. It's not perfectly graded, but it is somewhat of a flat, new surface for you to work on, kind of a blank canvas, as we say. But then the cons is that this is kind of the more expensive option because you're paying for a rental or for, professionals to come out and do it. It is labor intensive, and with the price and labor is you're hauling rolls of sod to and from your yard, and then you also need to find a place to dispose of it, because if you just leave rolls of sod in your yard, it'll take a really long time for it to dry out and break down, and even then you're kind of stuck with not the best compost. That first couple inches of soil is usually pretty good, but it's covered with roots and weeds and grass, so you might have to rake it out or sift it, and that can kind of be a problem. So the easiest way is just to dispose of it, taking it to a compost facility or something like that. And then the last con is the compaction that sod cutters leave. So when you use a sod cutter, because they're heavy, the ones we use are roughly 400 pounds. They vibrate really hard, and they actually compact that first couple inches of soil beneath where they cut. So it may be hard to actually plant plants into the ground again. As long as you can plant, whatever you're wanting to plant, that really shouldn't be a huge issue, but it does compact your soil more than solarization or sheet mulching does. So as I mentioned, we would cover a couple other little options, to remove turf. These may be better for people who have small areas. Just because if you have 1,000 square feet, I'm sure a lot of you are like, I'm not going to go shovel that because that's insane. So, hand digging is an option, but again, I'd recommend for small areas. This is labor intensive, and it'll take a little while, and it's hard to get every root. So you're going to want to make sure that if you go this method, you're really paying attention and getting all the sod out of the area. Another option is tilling. Some people will go either have a tiller or rent a tiller, and this is a very easy method to do. You just till up that turf, and it looks like it's now a dirt patch. The only thing is that it takes some time for it to really work. You're going to have to till multiple times over multiple years to really cycle those roots and stuff down underneath. And you can get grow back very quickly. So tilling is another great option, but it's something, it's kind of like a duct tape patch fix. It only works for a little bit, and then you're going to have to do it again. So tilling is also an option. Another option that people see is spraying herbicides. The reason we didn't cover this one in depth is because herbicides, is bad for the environment and yourself. So you're introducing other chemicals into your yard and stuff like that. A lot of people think about salt and vinegar and stuff like that to kind of get away from the harmful chemicals that are found in common herbicides. The only issue with salt and vinegar is that once you put enough of that down, that whole area, all that soil and stuff like that, will take a while to amend back and actually be plantable again, because once you put something in the ground and it gets a little bit of that vinegar or salt in it, those roots will shrivel up and die right away. So we usually, stray away from spraying herbicide, but again, it is an option. And then like spraying herbicide, you can neglect your yard, stop watering, stop mowing, everything like that. And the grass will die away fairly quickly, but then you're left with huge weed patches, and they're really untamed. And another issue is that it can really destroy your soil. So if you aren't watering and you don't amend your soil or fertilizers or stuff like that down, your soil will shrivel up, and really all that can thrive there is weeds at that point.
So let's take a quick break for some questions. I've answered a couple of them live, but we'll kind of go back to them. I do want to thank Judith for this plug. You can get free mulch at Get Trip Drop, which you can see this in the Q&A. Getchipdrop.com, and so that's a great option if you're going to do the sheet mulching. So just wanted to give a shout out to Judith on that. Maureen asks, are any of these techniques better than others in killing off weed coverage instead of sod or grass? I'm curious what your thoughts are on the sod cutter, just because I think we've had some experience with that, but just in general.
Yeah, so I think with a question like that, you run into a couple things of what type of weeds you actually have in your yards. Because if you have huge thistles and stuff like that, using a sod cutter would definitely cut deep enough and remove a lot of those roots, a bunch of bindweed, stuff like that. Sod cutters would be great for that, but then you're dealing with picking up thistles and trying to dispose of them. Solarization is probably one of the better options for getting rid of weeds, simply because it will burn out and kind of crisp everything in there. The lasagna method, because it's so damp and there is still nutrients and stuff going to your soil, those weeds will come back up through eventually. So you're going to want to make sure you're pulling those. But as far as mass removing large areas of weeds, just like with turf, sod cutter would probably be the best option, because you can cut up to 4 to 5 inches deep on those and really get all those roots out right away. But then you are kind of left with, depending on how your area is, if you have a lot of weeds, you're either pulling through or raking out all those weeds, because I would imagine it's not like turf where it's all connected, so you have a bunch of different weeds. So you're trying to sift through a bunch of clean cut dirt at that point too, and then you have to worry about seeds and stuff like that as you're removing them. So solarization would probably be the best option, just to kind of crisp and fry everything in that area.
Got another one. Is it worth rototilling after sod cutting?
So we get this question a lot with homeowners who we've performed lawn removal services with, and my advice is as long as you can plant or dig a hole big enough to plant your plants in that area, I wouldn't recommend tilling. Tilling sometimes can definitely loosen and help that soil, but because you've removed 2 to 3 inches of that really good topsoil that your yard naturally has, if you till it up, you may be cycling that down lower than you want it to. And so your soil and the way it's, the soil zones are laid out, that topsoil can be eliminated. So you want to keep that, kind of more nutrient rich topsoil at the top if you can. So tilling is definitely an option if you have a very compact area. It'll help loosen it up and make it easier to plant. And it won't take long for that soil to come back to the way it's supposed to. But tilling can definitely help disturb kind of that natural, topsoil nutrient barrier that your yard has already created with that sod. So it's really a personal preference on, if you're willing to dig and work a little bit harder to get those plants in the ground, or if you'd rather just till and then, roll the dice on having those plants, survive for a little while.
Perfect. I think we're ready for irrigation.
Awesome. So we've gone over a bunch of removal methods, and hopefully you'll be able to find a solution that works for you. That's within your skill set and your budget and kind of everything like that. But you're not done there. Converting the irrigation system is really the whole reason why you would do a turf removal. If you're doing it simply aesthetically, you don't have the idea of cutting back your water in mind. So I personally think this is the most important part. And if you remove your turf and are watering just as much as you were, again, you're not saving any water. And that's not really the point of why Colorado is pushing turf removal so heavily. So I'll briefly talk about how to convert your system, kind of more of a educational aspect. I won't go into super specific stuff, but it's always great to reach out to local professionals and stuff like that and get their input as well. So irrigation can be really scary for some people. You look at it and you go, I have no idea what I'm doing. You have valve boxes in your yard. That's like the picture on the right here, where it's just a bunch of wires and you have no idea what you're doing. But it can actually be fairly simple to convert your irrigation. We recommend that you usually convert to some sort of drip irrigation just to really maximize how much water you're actually saving. So there's some great options. There's drip retrofit conversion kits. This one in this image on the left is actually a Rainbird model, but they make, Hunter and all sorts of stuff for whatever you have in your yard. But really all you need is a drip conversion kit, and all you would do is you go through and you'd cap all the other heads in that zone, which is fairly simple to do. You just dig up the heads that are in that area, and then you just put on usually a 3/4 inch cap. And then you put this drip kit, conversion kit, on one of the heads, and then you just run pipe of your choice. There's either Netafin or, puncture hole 1/2 inch drip piping. And then, you can just run water to each of your plants, which is really nice. Another a little bit more affordable and not as, in-depth conversion is doing an above ground drip conversion. And this would just involve connecting a soaker hose to your spigot, or even into your valve box with a hose bib or something like that if you have it. But you essentially just turn off the whole zone, and then you can just run this soaker hose and kind of go around your plants and your xeriscape, and just run water for a couple minutes right off the spigot, and that'll totally do it. The more kind of labor intensive technical side of things is converting your whole zone. So that would be, finding where all your lateral zone lines are and capping all your heads, and then running brand new drip pipe from a valve box and a valve all the way to those plants and kind of the area you want. So if you're willing to get your hands dirty and, Personally, YouTube is a great option to learn how to, what's in your yard and stuff like that, as far as irrigation goes. But if you're, inclined to trench a little bit through your yard and stuff like that, this is a great option as well. Again, I would, consult with local professionals and stuff like that, just because it can be a little bit more intense. But as I mentioned, kind of the one I would recommend the most is just doing a Rainbird drip conversion kit. They're really easy, and pretty much everywhere sells them. Home Depot, Lowe's, everything like that, your local hardware store. So all you need is again, the picture on the right. You just need a drip conversion kit, and you would unscrew one of the heads that you think is best. If you do it in the middle, you can do a split where you run two different pipes to two different areas. You can do them in the corners where you just run one pipe throughout your whole xeriscape garden or something like that. But once you unscrew that head and put in this drip conversion kit, it's fairly simple and easy to do. You then dig, like I mentioned, you dig out those heads, the remaining heads in that zone. So what I mean by that is all the heads that turn on when you turn on that irrigation zone to be watered, you would cap all of them but one. And then you would run piping from this head that you changed out. So this conversion kit head, like as you see in the picture on the right, you'd run piping from that. So there's a couple options. There's Netafin drip line, which comes in a variety of spacing. I think they have 6, 12, and 18-inch hole spreads. So as you can see in the picture, the top picture on the left, there's little holes that are already pre-punctured. So you can just run that around your plants, and as it runs and turns on, it'll slowly drip out around those plants. Another option is a emitter drip line. I personally really like this more than Netafin, just because you can, control the point source of water that you're actually putting down. So you can connect a 1/2-inch drip line, and then all you do is you just poke little holes into it, and you run what's called spaghetti tubing to each of your plants, and you can put it right at the base. And this allows for, again, point source watering. So with the Netafin piping, you have certain spaced holes, so you kind of have to line up your plants around there, or have the holes in between all plants and let it soak for a little bit. But with emitter drip lines, you can just, hook it right up to that plant and know that that plant's getting water right at the base. Plus you wouldn't have to water it as long. But then, like I mentioned, capping heads, that seems to be a question most people ask, is how do you do that? So in the picture on the left, if you kind of have some heads that are above ground, or even if they're in ground a little bit, you can dig them out. Again, Home Depot, Lowe's, your local hardware store, they sell actual caps that can go right on the top of your irrigation head. But if you're someone like me and wants it to look really nice, you would actually dig those heads out, and then where that head, you can kind of see it on the bottom left photo, where that head is connected to the actual line. You can put one of these white 3/4-inch caps, again, found at any local hardware store, Home Depot, Lowe's, and put it right on that pipe, and then cover it up, so that way you don't have any old irrigation heads in your yard.
Perfect. I have a couple questions, and then we can head into plants. If trees have roots established in an area you are converting to drip, what adjustments need to be made?
Yep, so that's a great question. I would recommend running drip to those trees. If you have fairly well established trees, trees that have been around for 15 years or so, even 10 years, they are drawing water from all over your yard, not just that area that your zone is running. But if you have, some new saplings or some trees you just planted, I would definitely recommend connecting, again, in that zone. I would just run either Netafin or emitter drip line right to the base of those trees, just to help make sure you're getting water there. But usually with very large trees, or trees that have been around for, even 5 years, 5 to 10 years, their root system is so vast and spread out that they'll draw water from all other points in your yard. And so if you are, xeriscaping a whole front yard or something like that, where you're cutting off all water in that area, I would recommend, connecting drip to those areas, just to make sure your plants grow. And what I've found with a lot of things, and with my experience, is that once a tree is actually hooked up to drip, they grow 10 times faster and 10 times bigger, and they bloom way prettier and stuff like that. So making sure you actually have a water source is a great option. But like I said, it's not completely necessary for some of those mature trees.
Similar, can you use a porous drip line around the base of the plant?
Yeah, so kind of like I mentioned that above ground irrigation, like that soaker hose. You can definitely weave that in and out around your plants. You just need to, know what kind of I guess above ground irrigation hose you've got, because sometimes they drip or they soak it, a gallon a minute or a gallon an hour, or sometimes it's half a gallon a minute, half a gallon an hour. So you just want to make sure that you're putting the proper amount of water down. But yeah, you can definitely run soaker hose really anywhere. And that's very similar with like the Netafin piping as well.
Okay, can you or should you remove an in-ground system if you go with an above ground drip hose?
Again, that's kind of a personal preference. The one thing you'll want to make sure is that you've actually turned off that zone. There's a couple ways to do that. You can do that at your control clock and make sure that that's all the way off. You can also do that by finding the valve that zone actually locates and making sure you turn down all the flow controls on that to make sure it's all the way off. But again, it is a personal preference. So as long as you don't mind having, those heads in the ground where you've had them, it shouldn't be a huge deal to try and remove them. I would recommend, capping heads and stuff like that just to make sure. But you can run into some issues if you leave your zone in ground, things like freezing and stuff like that over the winter. If you don't properly blow out your system, that zone could freeze, that valve could break, and you could have a leak underground in that area that you may not know about for a really long time until it starts to show on the surface. So it is smart to get rid of it and try and, eliminate any sort of leaking water, which could come from leaving your system in the ground. But again, as long as you shut it off properly, make sure there's no water in that line after you shut it off, you should be good to go to just leave it in there and then run above ground irrigation.
That goes nicely into the next question. How do drip systems do over winter?
Yep. So just like any irrigation system, I'd recommend that you get your system blown out every year. This prevents pipes from freezing and cracking and, needing to be replaced every year. So with drip, because they're the actual lines themselves, like if you do emitters or Netafin or even soaker hose or something like that, after you run that for a season, it's all above ground. So eventually that water will evaporate and kind of get out of those pipes. So in the winter, you shouldn't have anything freeze. Plus drip piping is typically PVC, or not PVC, it's poly pipe, which is really flexible and durable. And as long as you don't puncture it, it's a really soft plastic. As long as you don't puncture it, it should totally be fine to hold from winter to winter. I wouldn't recommend doing, the thicker white PVC, because if it's not blown out properly every year, that is where you get those freezings and those cracks and stuff starts to break.
Perfect. All right, thank you. We'll run into different options for replacing the turf, which is the most exciting part. So we'll go through types of plant material and then how to find and source that material. So you can hit next, Hayden. So here we have 4 different options. So starting with native grasses, they are a great replacement to turf. It is native to Colorado. The one thing that you do want to keep in mind here is it does take a few years to grow in thick. I think, people see pictures like the one listed here and they're like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a perfect replacement for my turf. And then it's maybe slow to come in and then they kind of give up on that. And so just something to know, it does take a while to come in. You'll get them in plugs. And so it can be kind of patchy. You can also get seed, but that does take a little bit longer to come in, but you might be able to achieve kind of the thicker appearance a little bit sooner than the plugs, just in terms of not having that patchiness. But the seeds, will still take a while to come in. Over on the right, ground cover that's clover. That is a huge trend. I think last time we did this webinar, we had over a dozen questions on clover specifically. It is obviously very luscious coverage. It's not going to be as durable or water-wise as a native grass, but it is a great option to just kind of give you that nice thick coverage that, as you can see there, and you can still walk on it. And not to say, that it's not more durable, that it's, like a really weak plant, but it's just not going to be the same as a thick, kind of hardy native grass. My personal favorite is wildflowers. You can throw some seed down and it'll thrive pretty quickly. Obviously, kind of like the native grass, it does take a while for it to grow as big as this picture, but it is a really easy replacement. And a lot of people do mix it in with native grass seed. So that'll give you kind of a thicker coverage. It'll look more like a meadow. And so it's just a really cool option, I think, for people to add. And then in the bottom right corner, we have perennials, which obviously provide a lot of variety. They can take a while to become mature, but they do have kind of that quick look compared to any of the other options that may take time to grow in. And then over a couple of years, you'll have, kind of your own personal botanical gardens. So all great. It's really going to depend on what you want to do. And some people do a mix of different things. As much as you might want a botanical gardens, you might not want to have a full yard of that. So you can do some native grass in some areas, perennials in others. So yeah, just wanted to show the different options. Within that, oh, you can go back again. Within that, some of the things that we don't recommend is all hardscape. So just throwing down rock and calling it a day. While that might, seem easy, a lot of the reasons why we look at turf replacement and look at plant material is for the other ecological benefits, not just saving water. And so urban heat island effect is something that is very pertinent to people who live in cities. Kind of going back to that first slide of how we've changed the landscape. Urban heat island effect can make it really unlivable for, just you wanting to be in your yard, but also can contribute to your whole community being warmer. And so hardscape is really going to take on a lot of heat, whereas these plants are going to offset some of that. Also, hardscape doesn't promote material for our pollinators, which is another great ecological benefit of replacing turf. And it also just isn't as visually appealing as these 4 pictures show that plant materials can give. And so with the hardscaping, I do also want to touch on artificial turf because I know it is very, very popular right now. Similarly to hardscape, it is going to contribute to urban heat island effect. If any of you have ever been on turf or maybe have a student or a child that's an athlete who has been on turf, it can get very, very hot. So while we think about it as a way to still give our kids a place to play, when it's about 70 degrees, turf can be anywhere from 100 to 110 degrees. So it really does cook. And so that's just something that you're going to want to keep in mind. While it does provide benefits, there may be other options that are going to be better for you. And so just touch on that. And you also have the land waste component with turf. Within 10, maybe 20 years, you're going to have to be taking that to your local landfill, and then you're also going to be contributing some microplastics to your community. So just something to keep in mind on the AstroTurf component. You can go to the next one, Hayden. And so as far as finding plant material, it can be kind of hard to figure out what do you want to put in your yard. And so CSU Extension, using a local university is a great option. So you can check them out. They're going to be a really deep knowledge base. But as you can see from this photo, it's definitely structured for more academic style. So there's going to be publications or various articles about topics, which are great. There's also the AX extension. So you can give a specific question, and in a couple of days, they'll send you an email back from someone who's, studied this and can really give you an expert answer, which is a great resource. And so you can check out, different plants or ground cover, even broader, just kind of turf removal questions that you may have there. High Country Gardens is going to be another great resource. I think they work really well together. You can kind of get really good background information from CSU Extension, and then High Country Garden can give you the opportunity to kind of go through and see really what's going to work for you. So it is a store, but you can also use this if you just want to research, and then obviously you can buy from them as well. On the left, obviously this is a screenshot, so you can't see it. Highly recommend to check it out. The shopping options gives you opportunities to search based off of light requirements, the blooming time, height of plants, and then you can even look for certain advantages, like if it's bee friendly or a butterfly attractor. So it's a really, really great resource if you're wanting to kind of come up with your own design, especially with that height feature, because you can kind of see like, okay, I want a taller plant in the back or shorter plants in the front. So it's a really good opportunity to kind of take this into your own hands as far as DIY. So you can go to the next one. And then also Resource Central. We have Garden in a Box. We currently have gardens on sale this fall. And so you can check out our store. As you can see on the right, this is kind of what it looks like. You'll be able to pick a different themed box. They have different square feet sizes, depending on what you're looking to do. And then you'll be able to see all of the plants that come with that. And then you also get a map, to that 72 square feet, for example, on the Alpine Glow, and kind of where to put those plants specifically. So definitely check out the Garden in a Box store. Those are kind of those pre-made little boxes, and they'll give you an idea of what it's going to look like over the next couple of years. So as I said, gardens are on sale this fall, but if you're not ready to go this fall, you can also sign up for the newsletter, and then that way, when the gardens go on sale in the spring.
Awesome. So Tori just covered a lot of variety for plant material, native grasses, perennials, clover, all that stuff's great. But you also need ground material around those plants or kind of in that area. So you don't just have, kind of a dirt patch with some plants, because if you have bare dirt in that area, a lot of those plants, so even if they are water-wise and drought resistant, that soil won't hold moisture as long or as well. And so those plants will dry out. And so you'll essentially need to water them a little bit more than what you could be watering them if you had something like wood mulch, rock, or gravel. So wood mulch is definitely one of the top options because it's great for moisture retention. You can cut back your watering even a little bit longer after those plants are established. And it really helps with that heat island effect. Mulch, once it's cool and watered, it stays moist and helps with that temperature rising around your house. So if you're doing areas kind of really close to your house, I would definitely recommend mulch over rock, just to help keep those AC bills down in the summer. Excuse me. But another great option is rock or gravel, river rock, pea gravel, road base, all sorts of stuff like that is really great. Rock's great for to allow water into your soil. It infiltrates really easily. Like Tori was talking about, doing hardscapes. If you have a lot of rock in your area, it will warm the area and help contribute to that heat island effect. But a lot of people mix small pea gravel with mulch to help break up that infiltration rate, but also keep your area cool. So that's a great option. We had in our last webinar, we had a lot of people ask and kind of talk about rubber mulch. That is an option. There is rubber mulch, and I know some people live in areas where it's really windy, so wood mulch may blow away and stuff like that. You can find heavier bark mulch that is, it'll stay down on the ground. And they have a variety of options like that. Plus with rubber mulch, you do end up introducing, again, plastics, just like AstroTurf or solarization or something like that. You do end up introducing plastic into your yard, and it can not add as much of a natural nutrient barrier like wood mulch or gravel would do.
Let's take some questions. Got a bunch. We'll come back to the irrigation ones. There's a couple regarding plants. Are there particularly good native grass species or blends, and do they need to be mowed? I meant to touch on this. So blue grama and buffalo are the two main ones. Hayden, you can chime in too. Honestly, Hayden has the background in it. I have basic knowledge compared to him. But those are the two main ones. You can mow them shorter, but because it's going to be patchy for a little while, you're probably not going to want to do that, especially in the beginning. But you're still not going to cut them as short as you would your traditional turf. Hayden, anything additional there?
Yeah, definitely. So with native grasses, when you're mowing them, you're never going to get that feeling of turf again, because blue grama, long stem bluegrass, buffalo grass, stuff like that, they're stemmed grasses where they're a little bit more woody. They're not actually woody plants, but they are thicker, so it's going to be kind of prickly to walk on in your bare feet. So it's not something you can like, oh, I'm going to have turf again. It's just going to be native grass turf. The most common thing to do with native grass is to let it grow and get, as tall as you can bear, and then you kind of weed eat that down. Usually it's seasonally. But yeah, Tori totally nailed it right on the head with those common types of native grass.
Let's see. How about weed barrier under the mulch?
Great option. I was actually going to cover this as well, and I totally skipped over it. But after doing any sort of lawn removal method, whether you do solarization, sheet mulching, sod cutting, hand digging, anything like that, it is a good idea to put down some sort of barrier to help just make sure that you've knocked out all those grass roots and make sure nothing will come back. We highly recommend that you use cardboard, similar to sheet mulching. You don't need to water it or anything like that. But if you put a thick layer of cardboard down under your topsoil and under your mulch, that cardboard will help suffocate those weeds that are below. And you can just cut circles in that cardboard around where you're going to be planting, and it kind of acts as a natural weed barrier. The one downside with kind of using cardboard and stuff like that is that it would have to be replaced fairly often, not multiple times in a year, but once every 4 or 5 years you may want to redo your cardboard mulching just to help make sure those are down. People definitely put weed fabric down, but again, trying to be better environmentally and stuff like that, you're going to want to not use certain weed fabrics because you're introducing plastics. Plus some of those perennial plants or native grasses or whatever you're putting down may have trouble rooting through that. Even if you do cut holes like you do in cardboard, those roots may try to come back up and breathe a little bit, and that heavy plastic will definitely suffocate them. Plus, kind of helps with the heat of that topsoil. So your topsoil will be a little bit warmer compared to using cardboard or something like that.
What are your thoughts on dog tuff?
Dog tuff is great. Tori mentioned using plugs in her native grass talk, but dog tuff also comes in plugs, and it is definitely a low water grass. It uses less precipitation than average Kentucky bluegrass or whatever you may have in your yard, but it does take a long time to grow and kind of fill in. So if that's something you're interested in, it's a great option. I've seen a lot of homes do that, and it is low water. It's not as low as doing perennials or native grasses. You're still going to be watering a little bit more, but it is kind of a little bit more maintenance too, because once you are waiting for that dog tuff to spread out with those plugs, you can, weeds and stuff can sometimes outcompete it. So you really need to be on it. So dog tuff is a great option, and it is Waterwise, but it is a little bit more involved.
Sorry, we got a big stretch there. There was a question which, Hayden, I don't know that you'll know this, but what other Firewise ground cover options are there besides rock and gravel? I just want to touch on this. We recently did have a Firewise seminar. I'm not sure if it's available, if there was a recording or not. So if you want, you can reach out to Resource Central and see if you can get a recording of that. I think that might be super beneficial there. But Hayden, if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, so obviously I can't speak to the professionals could in that webinar, but when you have bark mulch, people are often worried that that's flammable material, and That is true. So you want to, be cognizant of that. But then with gravel, you have a really hot surface, and if a fire were to roll through it, it only helps increase that temperature of the fire. I'm fairly certain that's why the majority of people in our last webinar asked about rubber mulch, because it is cooler than gravel, and it's not as flammable as bark or wood mulch is. But again, at the end of the day, if you have any large fire rolling through your area, rubber mulch will essentially do the same thing, depending on how hot that fire is. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to Resource Central and trying to get a hold of that Firewise webinar, because I'm sure they have a lot more experience than I do.
I think we can wait. Let's get through the rest and then we can keep going. We got quite a few. I can just kind of transition nicely. So Resource Central, we do offer lawn removal services for partnering communities. We've actually recently opened up to full cost participants as well. So if reading all of these different ways to remove, if you're kind of like, I really don't want to do this, we can come out and give you a hand. And so definitely check out our website to see, if you qualify for a discount. But as I said, we are also taking full cost participants as well. And you can always use a garden in a box to replace that turf. Depending on your community, we do have a partnership where, you can get the service and then also use your discount partially towards getting a garden. So check out our website if you aren't really looking into doing these options yourself. But DIY can be very rewarding. I feel like we've given a lot of resources. I'm going to continue to send links into the questions that are asked. So if you go through there, you should be able to click on some of these options, and then we'll work with our seminar team to send out a list of links as well, so that you can have all the different resources and kind of figure out, what's really going to work best for you.
Awesome. And I think that wraps it up.
Yeah, so this is Hayden. Again, we'll continue working through these questions, but for those of you that want to hop off, this is Hayden Burnett. I am Tori Peterson. We're both on the turf replacement team with Resource Central. So yeah, with that, we'll get started. I'm going to head back to irrigation. Quite a few came in after we moved on from that. Can you partially convert a large zone so some of it is drip system, but some stays with standard heads?
That's a great question. So I guess it would be a tough question, but it is a good question. So when you introduce different pressure levels into a zone, you can have issues with how much water those original heads, like if you have sprays or rotors or high efficiency nozzles or something like that. If you put drip along that same zone, that drip line is going to need to run for a certain amount of time compared to those other heads. So my answer would be no, I wouldn't ever split a zone like that simply because of the pressure. But another huge factor is the timing that the watering needs are. There's, when you're spraying water out of a rotor or a spray head, you're putting down a lot more water per second than you are with drip. So if you run a mixed zone like that for 5 minutes, that's what you would need for your grass or something like that. If you're doing multiple cycles, even if you're running it for 20 minutes, the zone, half of the zone that has the regular heads in it are going to oversaturate the area, while your drip won't have enough water to those areas. So it gets really finicky with finding the proper amount of time to water each of those areas. So you'd essentially be, not really cutting back any water usage because you're still watering a heavy amount. So for something like that, I would recommend, trying that above ground irrigation, that drip irrigation where you're doing a soaker hose or something like that, if you're not wanting to convert a whole zone, just because you can still have those regular heads. Maybe you capped off all the ones that are in your zero escape native grass area, whatever you planted, and you can cap off those heads and then have the other heads running against the grass or trees or whatever you have, and then just run that soaker hose for a short amount of time around those zero escape plants.
going back to native grass, how much water does the native grass need, and does it make sense to just leave in the old sprinkler heads in place for this application?
Yeah, that's another great question. So it really depends on your native grass type that you select. Different types need different, number of inches per year to, stay maintained and healthy. It's significantly less than Kentucky bluegrass or, turf grass that you'd have in your yard. But as far as, the watering needs, just like with any xeriscaping plant, whether you do perennials or native grass or anything like that, if you don't water, a little bit more than you probably should the first couple years, those plants are never going to get established. So a lot of people don't realize that seeing actual water cutback results takes, a year or two, because you need to get those native grasses and those plants hardy and established in your yard. So once that happens, it's native to Colorado, especially the native grasses. You really don't need to water them all that much, very seldom throughout the summer. This year, I outside my window right now, there's a bunch of native grass, and I don't think they've watered once this year just because we've seen so much rain. But in the coming months, they may water 3 or 4 times in the next 2 months. So, and again, this that kind of native grass is well established. So the first couple of years, you're going to need to water it fairly regularly, not as much as you do your turf grass, but just make sure that it all gets germinated. If you're doing seed, or if you're planting, make sure it all, takes and gets to a fully mature state so it can kind of just be self-sustaining like it's supposed to. As far as leaving, your old irrigation system in, again, it depends on how you cut your native grass. Most people let it grow tall, and that's kind of the style. And so those heads that you may have in your ground are probably going to be spray heads or, small rotors. So they're not going to actually reach all that turf. So you're going to want to, either put extensions on those so they can, you can water over that native grass, because it does get a couple feet tall. But ultimately, again, personal preference. If you don't mind leaving irrigation in your yard, that's one thing. But if you take it out, just throwing down a sprinkler, once, maybe twice a month, it should totally be fine, like a hose bib one.
Perfect. And just so everyone knows, I am throwing some links into the chat, so you can check those out. Trying to crank them out through these questions. I really do want to touch on the High Country Gardens and CSU extension, because there's a lot of questions that are pretty specific about plants, and that's just going to be your best resource. You can check for your specific yard, whether that's shade, very sunny, really utilize that, because we're not going to be able to answer all the specifics that you might have. But I really do think between those two resources, you're going to be able to get pretty much all the info you need on your replacement plants. So yeah, with that, I do also want to touch on, also thank you, Molly, for giving us the link to the Firewise webinar. I'll also drop that link in there. So thank you again, Molly. Lori is asking if HOAs are coming around. Know someone whose HOA was denied, who denied their turf replacement and xeriscape plants. Lori, I'm going to link in the bill. The Colorado State Senate passed a bill basically ruling out that HOAs can no longer tell residents that they cannot switch to a Waterwise yard. Obviously, I think some HOAs are probably a little behind. This is a very new development, and so I think it is going to take a little while before we see that everyone is in compliance. Obviously, with all policy, there's a lot of nuance, and so I'm just going to give you the bill, and then you can kind of take your research from there. But it is something that is top of mind for us as we run into participants who are denied by their HOA. And so I'll just give this to you, and then hopefully you can get more information as you go to work with your HOA. Let's see. This will be an interesting question, especially we talked about this, Hayden, with botanical gardens. Recently heard that cedar mulch should be avoided because as a natural insect repellent, it can also reduce the health of the soil under it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so like botanical gardens does, and kind of like I mentioned briefly in this presentation, if you mix Any type of mulch in with pea gravel or something like that, it helps with that infiltration rate and kind of spread out those nutrients. If you use, cedar mulch, or dyed mulch, a lot of the cases is what it is, where it's, kind of a really bright brown or a really red color. You do introduce dyes into your yard, so that can, suffer some of your soil amending that you've probably done before you put mulch down. But yeah, cedar mulch, just like there's myths and problems with every sort of option that's out there. So I would recommend, staying away from dyes, staying away from, probably mulch that you've heard things about. But ultimately, if you are worried about, kind of nutrients and stuff getting through with, stuff like cedar mulch or other mulches, mixing in some pea gravel and making sure that there's, plenty of room and area for that soil to breathe and to actually get some of that water to infiltrate is a great option.
What is the best time to seed native grasses?
It's a great question. So, native grasses, they're not like Kentucky bluegrass where, they are gonna, really no grass is a warm season grass in Colorado. We have a lot of cool season grasses. So if you seed in the spring or in the fall, that's when you're going to have the best germination rate. So that's when, if you're putting down seed, that's when the seeds actually germinate and start to grow grass. If you do it in, July, June, July, August, you're going to run into a lot of those seeds just being burnt out. This year was a little crazy with all the water, so you probably could have planted or seeded in July this year. But yeah, I'd recommend, early spring, right before, temperatures, like a month or so before temperatures really start to rise. And then in the fall, even into September, you can definitely put down some native seed and let those germinate. And then they'll kind of incubate over the winter and then come back strong in the following season.
Perfect. Are there any stats available on how much water usage per day people have been gone down to after sod conversion? And what kind of information do we have on it? So if you want to talk about your equation for it, Hayden, and then I'll try to touch on the second half.
Yeah, so for our program, we run kind of a calculation where, we cut back roughly 11.7 gallons of water per square foot every year. So it's kind of a twofold number. So Kentucky bluegrass takes quite a bit of water. Our calculations are based on people, doing xeriscape gardens or perennials or native grasses. So if you remove, a certain amount of square feet, every square foot you remove after 2 years will save 11.7 gallons of water. So for a lot of people, that's a couple thousand, even a couple 100,000 gallons of water, depending on how big your project is. So that's kind of what we base ours off of, just because that's how much Kentucky bluegrass needs. And then once mature perennials and native grasses are taking place, you're really not watering those anymore. So after 3 or 4 years, it's really just supplemental water during those really dry years, and a little bit of, maintenance water. You're not watering every week. You're not watering multiple times a week. So yeah, a square foot of grass conversion, 1 foot by 1 foot, little square, is roughly 11.7 gallons saved per year.
Perfect. And then the second part of our question was what our backlog looks like to come out for grass removal this year. Our crews are cranking this time of year. They've gotten very fast. And so we're still taking applications. Our removal season will go into September, but we definitely recommend that people get their applications in as soon as possible. Discounts are based on the amount of people who do it. And so your best chance at a discount is going to be, first come, first serve. And so getting that app in, if you're going to do full cost, still recommend getting an application in, just because if, we get to a point where we've taken on, so many projects with our partners, that we might not be able to get to yours. So again, as soon as possible. If you have any questions, let us know, give Resource Central a shout, and we'll send a follow-up too with all of the contact information for the different teams as well. And so I did want to touch on all the resources I've been putting into the chat. Hopefully you guys are able to see them. The one thing I do want to add as a tip for the CSU extension in particular is, and this is going to sound redundant, but go to Google and type in CSU extension and then the topic that you're looking for. I just think the way that their website is set up, it's very kind of blog style, so it can be difficult to find specifically what you're looking for. Whereas when you Google it, you can usually find articles or resources right away. So definitely check that out. Just got a question about partners. So you can check out our website, go to resourcecentral.org, and then you can go to the programs tab. And then depending on which program you're looking for, you can see the available partners there. So definitely check that out. Christine asks, we are solarizing our yard. What should we do once we remove the plastic and the grass is dead? Should we rake, put down compost or manure before the weed barrier and mulch? Thanks.
Yeah, so great question about solarization. You definitely, the first thing I just want to mention is you're going to want to make sure that you've had that plastic or that tarp on for as long as you can possibly have it. With it being a cool season this year, you may need to run that a little bit longer than expected. But once that grass is completely died out, exactly, I would recommend raking. Make sure you get all that dead leafy material out of there, at least the grass. Some people will think, well, I'll go ahead and I'll just till it now. But some of those grass blades and some of the rhizomes and roots that you may have put in or tried to fry with the solarization, they may actually have not worked all the way through. So you may start having grass growing back. So I'd recommend, raking it all out and removing it and then letting that dry. And then you can slowly cycle that in as a natural compost. But once the area is all that turf is dead and you've kind of raked it out, compost is great, doing manure, any sort of compost or something like that. I would definitely recommend that you put down some sort of barrier like cardboard, and then kind of do that manure and stuff like that, just in case there is any straggling roots or grass blades or stuff like that may come back. That way you have a kind of a natural barrier, and then you can do your topsoil and everything like that. And I would, probably recommend that you let that just sit out how it is for the off season, in the winter, and let that grass just really die out and make sure, if it's going dormant, it's not going to come back in the following year. And then that's when you can kind of till or mix all that stuff in to kind of get a level surface to then plant those plants.
Perfect. A couple more irrigation. Drip systems need a pressure regulator to lower the pressure. What is a good place for it?
Yep. So that's a great question. Obviously, someone who's a little bit more in tune with their irrigation, which is great. Pressure regulators are good, depending on how much water you're actually putting out. Most residential homes actually don't put out that much PSI. So depending on how big your space is, now if you are running a drip zone where there's 2 plants being watered, yeah, you're definitely going to want to put a pressure regulator on, and you're going to want to do that somewhere before your valve where that water's coming in. You can also do it after your valve. But the main thing with drip systems isn't so much the pressure regulator, because pressure regulators are really meant for pumps where you're drawing large quantities of water and moving, a lot of feet ahead and a lot of PSI. Most drip systems, if you get like a drip valve or even that drip conversion kit, there's filters in there which automatically reduce your pressure, because those filters will either spin or stay still, and they'll limit the amount of water that goes into the actual drip line that your plants are receiving. So that's also a great option as well. Some people put pressure reducers right off the side of their house, like right after their backflow preventers. But those are usually for people who have really high water pressure in their areas, and then they have a lot of drip zones. And those can be a little bit more intuitive and kind of a little bit more in depth, but yeah.
Similar, do you need to reduce the pressure when winterizing if using the emitter system?
That's a great question. So, when you're using emitters and you're puncturing holes, you can put the actual connection that that thin little tubing goes to. You can get those are actually considered pressure reducers, and they do so by limiting how many gallons per hour your system is putting out. So they're color coded. I haven't installed in a little while, so the colors and the actual sizes are, I don't have them off the top of my head, but like red pressure reducers, I think, are half a gallon an hour. So those, your pipe will be fully pressurized, kind of your main drip line. And then each emitter that you plug in there will have its own specific amount of water that can actually get through. So that's a great option for kind of a natural, or for a drip pressure reducer. But yeah, it all depends on how much water each of your perennials or whatever you're planting need. Like if you're hooking up drip to trees, you're going to want a gallon, maybe a gallon and a half per hour, maybe 2.5 gallons. Just allow it for more water to come out for stuff like trees. But then like perennials, you can do a 1/4 gallon an hour depending on what your plant needs. So that's a great option for kind of a makeshift pressure reducer.
Perfect. Our last one, how did drip systems stand up to solar degradation of the plastic?
It's a great question. So like I said, the black poly pipe or the Netafin piping, it'll, over the winter, and even, like you said, with the sun beating down on it, it'll last a long time. It is very durable. Irrigation components and piping has come a long way. The biggest thing you have to worry about is, hitting it with a weed eater or hitting it with a mower, having people run through it and accidentally puncturing it. But as far as, kind of the pipe itself, usually I recommend that when you install pipe and drip lines, that you put them under your mulch or kind of ground cover. That way, there's an added layer of protection there. People do have to replace their drip lines, every 5 to 10 years. It's fairly inexpensive, and after you do it once, it's super easy. And I, with the sun and the heat that Colorado sees, it's not like Arizona where you're worried about pipes like decaying or getting burnt out. Plus in the winter, it's so cool, that stuff stiffens up really quickly and is more of a hard pipe than it is soft in the summer. So
Perfect. Well, that is all of them. Thank you so much, Hayden. I know you answered a lot of questions. Just want to thank everyone for attending. And again, want to thank City of Brighton for sponsoring this webinar. Working on getting all of the links that I sent, but gonna add a couple more. And so again, great resources out there. Definitely recommend checking out CSU Extension, High Country Gardens, and then you can always check out Resource Central as well. But again, thank you everyone and have a great night.